All right, we need to talk about something that happens sometimes, and we were lucky enough for someone to come up with the solution. See, when you have the square root of a negative number, we've talked about this, I hope. When you have the square root of a negative number, you think, well, 7 times 7 gives me 49. But if 7 is positive, then the other 7 is positive, and that gives you a positive 49. If 7 is negative, then the other 7 is negative, and two negatives make a positive 49. And so to do the square root, there's no way to get a negative 49. And so now we have a problem, because if we're trying to solve an equation like we are below here, if I'm trying to solve that, I subtract 1 from both sides, x squared equals negative 1. I square root both sides, and x equals plus or minus the square root of a negative number. And I can't get that. And so then all of a sudden we say, we don't have a solution, because there is no real number that you have the square root of a negative to get you an answer. There is no number that works here. There is no square root of negative 1. There is no real number. And so a lot of times when at the beginning of the year we talk about real numbers, and then people say, well, is there such a thing as a fake number? Well, today is the day that you learn about fake numbers, because we are going to introduce a new number, and I know you're going to love this. Our number is I. I know it's a letter. It says I, but it is now going to be a number. Okay? And that number is the definition of I is I equals the square root of negative 1. That is the actual definition of I. I equals the square root of negative 1. And so we use I because mainly it's easier to write than the square root of negative 1. So if I get the square root of negative 49, what we can do is we can split that up to negative 1 times 49. And so then that's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 49. The square root of negative 1, we already decided was I. And the square root of 49 is 7, so we can reduce this to 7i. Then we have the square root of negative 6. Now, 6 doesn't have a square root, and it doesn't have a square root in it. But it doesn't mean we're not done. We cannot just leave a negative inside the square root like that. So what we do is we split it up into negative 1 and 6. And we say, well, the square root of negative 1 is I, and then we're still left with the square root of 6. So this would actually be my answer, I square roots of 6. Okay, the next thing you need to look at is I squared. I squared, well, look at I is the square root of negative 1, and then we square that, and so then we have the square root and the squared cancel, so my answer is negative 1. So I is really the only number that we have that we can square and get a negative answer instead of a positive answer. So then when I look here and I have I times the square root of 5 squared, I need to distribute that. Remember, I can distribute because it's a multiplying problem. So now I have I squared and the square root of 5 squared. And I squared, that's negative 1, we just talked about that. And the square root and the squared cancel here, so I get times 5. So I have negative 1 times 5, I get negative 5. Alright, so now it looks like we get to solve. So in order to solve this, I need to get x squared by itself. So I'm going to move the 10 over. I get 3x squared equals negative 36. Divide both sides by 3, and I get x squared equals negative 12. Square root both sides, and so we get x equals, remember, plus or minus, and then I need to split up this negative 12. Okay, I've got square root of negative 1, and then I've got a 4 and a 3, right? Because if I take 4 times 3, I get 12 times negative 1, I get negative 12. So I'm splitting it up so I can simplify. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of negative 1 is I. And then I can't square root 3, so I'm left with that. So this would be my answer. Plus or minus 2i square roots of 3.